Hi everyone, this is Al McKay and I wanted to welcome you to this new video in the 10-part Decimation video training. So I've received hundreds of emails at this point and I'm still catching up on a lot of them, so bear with me. My goal is actually, once this video is up, in other words, once you're watching this, I'm going to be responding to a lot of email. So if I haven't responded to your email yet, expect a response soon. Now, I'm really blown away by the response, as well as a lot of examples I've already seen on Facebook and Instagram from you guys showing off what you've been doing. Even compositors who've never done 3D in their lives have been going through, following the training, and getting a lot of success. Not to mention a lot of you who've actually been using different software packages and still been able to go through successfully throughout all the training. Now, for a lot of you who are just starting out and you're new to 3D and visual effects, go at your own pace. Don't feel like you're in a rush. We've got plenty of time. And on top of that, I've got a lot of starter videos on YouTube that you can go through those tutorials and get up to speed fast. But either way, this isn't a race, so just have fun with it. These are videos, and the advantage of that is that you can see step by step what I'm doing, and it's just a matter of playing through a couple of times until you get it. Okay, so take it easy, have fun, and just commit to the training, and you'll do fine. So the big focus of this training is that we're going to use Phoenix FD, and we're going to be creating a smoke simulation to fill in the gaps of all the negative space inside of the ash, and it's all going to be emitting from the performance of Thanos. So the whole point is that the effects that we've done so far in video 1 are now going to drive the entire smoke simulation as we create it. Now, if you don't have Phoenix FD, that's totally fine. You can use fume effects, you could use turbulence FD, you could use pyro effects, Maya fluids, whatever you like to do the smoke simulations, that's totally fine. All of these are the same. The results, the process, it's all the same thing. They're just in different software packages. Now, after this video, I'm really excited to dive into a lot of additional training. We're going to be doing a close-up shot of Thanos as his whole entire face breaks apart into ash, and this is the shot prior to the one we're currently working on. So as we work through the edit, we're going to have all of these shots start to piece together. So there's lots we're going to be doing. I'm super excited about this. All of the techniques and the process involved in this training is all based on the work that I've done on Avengers Endgame, as well as other feature films. And a lot of this is directly applied to what we're doing in this training. Finally, every single day I'm going to be trying to do a live stream, so make sure to follow me on Instagram and YouTube. And the reason for that is that during the FXTD mentorship, one thing that we regularly do is live reviews. In other words, every couple of weeks, we get together and we do a live webinar, a private one with all the students inside the course, and what we do is we go through, look at the work, and I'll give feedback on everyone's work, answer questions, and this is a great opportunity for us all to work together as a team. This is based on dailies when we work in visual effects. Every morning we get together, we review the work with the visual effects supervisor, get feedback, apply it, and every day the work is better, better, better until it's finalized. So that's why I'm so excited about this. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. So like I said, I'm really excited about this training. We've got until July 21st, so we got plenty of time as we go through this, but keep in mind to stick with it. It's usually a common thing that a lot of people, they get excited about something, then they watch video 1, video 2, and they start to taper off. Now, a lot of the training, a lot of the success, a lot of the growth that you're going to get is all coming in from seeing things through. So I'm one of those people that I'd like to look back at the things that were tough, but I saw it through, and in the end I got all the value and I was able to grow from doing that, rather than looking back at all the things that I started and never actually finished. Okay, so hopefully you're not one of those people. Let's stick with this, and I'm really excited to get into video 2 and all the future training. So let's dive in. Okay, so as we get into this, where we left off last lesson was that we had ran a cache and we had split it up into groups. Now what I want to do is bring back in that cache. So just having this here, there's a checkbox that I mentioned, I think, to turn off. And what it'll do if we have it on is it'll actually bring in the cache automatically. So it's up to you. I mean, I wanted to just manually show how we can set it up without this here, just in case you need to know how to do that. But otherwise it'll do it for you if you have that checkbox turned on. So once the cache is ran, I'm just going to get this line, copy it, we close TyFlow. I also disabled TyFlow, so that way, if I'm scrubbing through the scene, it's not going to be too laggy. It is a little bit laggy, and that's to do with the Alembic cache being constantly fed in. So with our Thanos character here, every single object technically is pulling from the same file. It doesn't bring up that directory, but you get the idea. So all of these pieces are being fed in. So I figure it's worthwhile mentioning that, because what I ultimately would prefer would be actually using a regular geocache. Like Maya and Max, I think, use the same file format these days, and that is a lot more efficient because it will load it in the memory, and you can do it per object and per frame as well. So what ends up happening is it's much more smaller files, and once it's loaded in the memory, then you can scrub around. So there's little things like that that are a lot quicker, but for convenience of us being able to load up one file, it's, I'm happy to make that sacrifice for this lesson. But the reason it's laggy is because it's streaming from one big file for everything all the time, which is kind of inefficient. So what we can do now is I'm going to go to create, and then down to TieFlow, and we have the tie cache. And I'm just going to drag that into the viewport. I'm just looking at this icon thinking a lot of people are probably not familiar with floppy disks. They're probably wondering what that is. So that's a 3.5-inch floppy disk, high density. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the modify panel, and we just go down here. And what this is, it allows us to bring in our cache that we had cached out last lesson. So this is our cache, and I think right now TieFlow doesn't like negative frames. I'm going to talk to Tyson about that, because I think pre-roll is pretty standard for a lot of us. Like I'll say this about feature film production. Not typically, but some studios will actually work. Let me just bring this in for a second so I can explain something really quick. So one thing I'll mention is that we're going -50, but we're starting our shot at frame 0 or frame 1. Now, there are definitely a lot of studios where instead of working at frame 1, because again, pre-roll is a thing, what a lot of studios will do is they'll actually start at frame 1000. And that way, if you needed to go negative, you just go into frame 900 or whatever. So that's what a lot of studios do as a standard, and that way the negative frames don't become an issue. And again, I just want to reiterate that I am going to segue and mention these things occasionally, at least with YouTube. When I've only started doing YouTube the last 6 months, but that's been a constant thing. It's like, Alan, just tell us the steps. We don't care about you talking all the time. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to communicate things that are actually extremely relevant. And this is the problem with a lot of training out there, is that, it's people who are probably not in the industry and they're just telling you, click this button. I'm trying to convey information that is going to make you a better artist. My entire goal with all of this is for you to be working at studios. I want those of you who are doing this training to communicate and talk to me, because the more I'm aware that you exist, the more that I can hire you and the more that I can recommend you for jobs. Okay? And I can't take on 99% of the jobs that land in my inbox every day. So I'm constantly building up a network of artists who I'm recommending to a lot of big studios. A lot of the students in the mentorship are at ILM, Weta, and Scanline. Scanline, there's about 15 or 20 students from the Effects TD mentorship working there now. It's crazy. And even last week, Cindy went on to go to Scanline, and like 2 weeks before that, there was someone else. And this year alone has been huge. So again, I'm mentioning this just once because I want to clarify this, that my goal with this training is not to put out some training so you get to, watch some cool stuff. I'm building everything with the intent of getting results, getting a job, getting your skills to the right level that I can hire you, I can recommend you, if you're, active enough to actually show me what you're doing, so that way you're on my radar, rather than just putting out tutorials that, show a little hack or a little quick trick. Okay? But the key thing about that is I do want to mention things that are relative to you at the studios. So there's my rant, but I want to clarify that the reasons I talk about these things is because it's way more vital information than I think a lot of what we're generally talking about. So with that pre-roll, that would be the result for it. So I could be wrong, or maybe it's been fixed. Actually, it is working now. So earlier versions were not picking up the negative 50 frames. It'll just start at frame 0. So that's awesome. So all I've done is I just loaded this cache. And it might take a moment because it's bringing it all in. And I believe it's also loading it automatically into memory. So unlike TyFlow, where we would need to calculate it all the way through, and then it's loaded into RAM, this instantly loads it into RAM in the beginning. So that's another thing I want to talk about really quick, is that we have this loaded in, but when you get really big caches and you've got a lot of them, it can mean that your load times on your file are going to be extremely slow, a lot of different things. So it's up to you. I like the fact that we have this feature, but I'm going to turn that off so that way it's not storing it in RAM. In other words, it's going to be constantly reading this file in, which is going to be slower. So keep in mind, I'm not going to be scrubbing back and forth a lot. I'm going to be jumping from frame to frame, just because right now we're dealing with a heavy cache to work with. So that's one thing that we can do, and that way, at least when we load our file, it's not having to store everything in memory and preload it all up, which should make it a bit faster. But in general, this is what we're working with now. I believe that's the belt that we're getting these big frags. So, I mentioned that before, that I should probably throw a shell modifier on it or run it through another Voronoi to break it up more. So I believe that's what that is, where we're getting these big chunks. I don't mind it. It's different, but yeah, ultimately I'd probably want to break it down more. But keep in mind, this is version 1 of what we're doing. If this was a real production, we need to see a first version, so then we can make those creative decisions about what we need to adjust. But for the sake of speed, I'm just rolling with what we have. The other thing I wanted to bring up is that I mentioned this last lesson, that in my version, I went a little bit further and filled out some volume just to cover that negative space. So I just want to mention this really quick, because again, jumping to the camera view, personally, I don't like the fact that we can see inside of his armpit. So that's one thing that I had resolved in my own version, which was very similar to the head. What I got is I had the torso, and I think I did the same thing for the legs as well. And all I did is I got one version which is a shell modifier, so in other words it's hollow, and then there's another one where I used a cap modifier instead. So I got rid of the shell modifier, I put a cap holes modifier, and what that would do is it will close up the mesh and make it a solid mesh. And from there I filled those particles up, like I filled the volume out with lots of particles, exactly how we did the head. So I'm just going to take a second to explain this, but I think this is valuable information. I hope you can see it as valuable information. And so with the head, we didn't frag it. What we did instead is we populated particles on the surface. So I would do similar. I would do I think there's actually a birth surface, but then okay, there's no birth surface. So there's a few different ways to do it. You could do birth voxels, but they'll be slower because it's a level set. I would probably just do a birth and then a position object. And I would just fill the volume and do a fast convex. So the whole point is that you could fill out a solid version of this and just have lots and lots of particles blowing out. I also see, like I've heard a lot of people complain about Avengers Infinity War, that it's silly that the faces are hollow inside, and they should have more density. So that's kind of like what we're doing. We're filling out all of this with particles inside, so there is volume, and then that can flutter away. Personally, I feel like the reason that they're hollow inside is because too much of this stuff, it just gets cluttered. It doesn't look very elegant. So I think it's more of a stylistic choice. It wasn't like they accidentally made them hollow. I think it's because you can go crazy with this stuff and it gets a little bit overbearing. But yeah, that's what I would do. I'd fill out the volume of the chest with lots of particles. That would resolve that. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of quickly rant about that, but I think it is really, really valid. So, like I said, in general, I want to be very careful with your time, but these are just a few things I want to convey that I'm hoping will just kind of give you some ideas as to how you can enhance the shot even more. Now, what we're going to be doing in this lesson, we're going to set this up to be going through, we're going to use Phoenix. We can do like a fluid simulation for all the dust, and that's going to fill in a lot of those negative, the negative space in here is going to be all dust. Because my whole way that I work is I'll have large chunks, small chunks, and then I'll have like mist or volumetrics. And what that will do is it'll be more the macro, like the really small stuff, essentially. So that's the whole idea. Beyond that, what we'll do first is I'm going to set this up where each body part is a separate cache, and that would allow us later to set up shaders. I want to keep the rest of this lesson pretty short. I want to focus just on Phoenix as well as setting it all up. And then later on, we're going to get into doing we'll do a bit of lighting now, but we'll do the shaders and the rendering and compositing in a later lesson because I want to batch it together with a few of the other shots that we're doing. One lesson I'm really excited about in particular is that we're going to be working on Thanos. We're going to be doing a close-up shot of him turning to ash, which is going to be really, really cool. So having him entirely turning to ash and breaking apart, we can also see the arm starting to break here and it's starting to break down here. So having his body beginning to rip apart, which transitions into the current shot that we're working on. So that one's coming up. That one's going to be a big one. We're going to be doing some really advanced techniques, building upon what we're currently doing, but doing a whole different approach, which is going to be procedural. It's going to use a lot of growth techniques, and it's going to be awesome. Okay, so with our cache, one thing I'm just going to rename this. So we've got a cache, I'm going to say TFC for Tyflow Cache, just an abbreviation. And let's call this the lower body. And what I'll do is we actually have these elements set up. Okay, so we have, I think it's elements, yeah. So we set up the export groups A, B, and C, I believe. Now, it's a little bit backwards, in my opinion, the way that it does it, where by clicking these export groups, it's actually eliminating them from the cache. So in other words, rather than saying turn these ones on, clicking on these is actually turning it off. Now it's a little bit slow because our cache is so big, but we can see we just got rid of the arms, or the skin, I should say, because we broke into skin, shirt, and lower body. Because the lower body is all leather. His shirt obviously is cotton, or however Thanos rolls, and then we have the skin. So these are shaders that we're setting up that we're going to use. So I'm just turning off the skin and I believe the shirt, and then C should be just the lower body. So by doing that, we're now left with just the lower body. And I can right-click, clone, copy, and then we can call this shirt or torso or chest, whatever we want to call it. Now again, this is where things do get a little bit slow and tedious, and this, as far as I'm concerned, like what we're doing in this portion would be, we're setting things up to send to the lighting and rendering department. Okay, so this is where we would hand these assets over to the lighters or the scene assemblers to put together the shot. But, you know, typically, since we're still developing the effects, we want to have things pretty fast. So one thing we can do, which would make things even faster, but we can't see what we're doing, is go to display, and then we can see display in viewport. And we've got different options in here. We can lower the percentage that we can see. We can make it to a bounding box, and that way all the chunks are represented that way. There's different things we can do, or we can turn it off in the viewport altogether. Now, when that's turned off, it actually makes everything a lot faster to load. So let's just turn this back on, 100% meshes, but turn display off. And we'll change the export group. So B is visible, but A and C are invisible. You can see how much quicker that is now. So right click, clone, and we'll call this one skin. And this time we want just B and C to be hidden, A to be visible. Okay, and with the lower body, same thing. If we want, I could just say display and viewport off. Now we have these three guys, but they're all turned off right now. Okay, so one thing I want to mention really quick is, and again, this is just typically how I work. We've got scripting, and in here you have the script listener. So this just brings up a lot of jargon, but if you click macro recorder enable, and I just want to mention this so you're aware that it's here. And actually, later in one of the lessons, I'm going to teach some scripting. You might think like, oh, I don't want to script, that's not for me, but hear me out. I'm going to show you my way of doing it, which I think as artists will make sense for the first time, hopefully. But because I had the macro recorder turned on, it's verbose. In other words, it's spitting out information. I'm selecting an object, I'm deselecting it, and it's saying select, clear selection. So you can see under the hood what's happening. One of the things was, and dollars means like the selected object. So it's saying display off. And just as an example here, I'm going to say dollars TFC, because we said Typhlo cache, star or asterisk, and that is a wildcard. So in other words, it's saying TFC, anything named the object TFC, and then the star means like anything after that, it doesn't matter. So we can access all of these objects at once. I can say display equals true or on, whatever you want to say. And what that means is that it'll actually turn the display and viewport on for all these objects. That is taking a moment to do that, but you can see up here it was saying display off because we're hiding them on the viewport. This is turning it back on. So I just wanted to show that for a second, just because it might make your life easier. Because you could literally get this and like drag it up somewhere in here, and you'd have a little button if you wanted to that would allow you to turn the Typhlo caches on whenever you wanted, right? And like we can get a lot more technical than that, obviously, but right now this just means that we now have all of our objects loaded. But because we did skin, shirt, lower body, if I click on skin, we can see all of the skin caches have loaded. If I click on shirt, it's going to be just the shirt mesh. Lower body is all of that. So now when it comes to creating all our shaders, which we'll do at a later time, but when it comes to creating all of our shaders, we can assign the shaders to each object and represent the groups that we exported. And all of these were coming from our original Typhlo, because remember here we had particle group A, because that was the left arm, the skin on his arm. The chest was B, so let's see, export B, and we're saying set. So this was how we're able to set up these groups. And you'll notice we only set them up in these events. And that way it breaks it apart, it sends it out into here, but we're not assigning or reassigning or overriding anything. So it keeps that information with it wherever it goes. In other words, it remembers where it came from, even though it's now like been broken up multiple times and it ends up in a different event. When it gets exported, it's putting them into those buckets, into those groups that we talked about. Okay, so hopefully that kind of clarifies how you can split things up into groups and export it all and do it all as one cache and be able to bring it all back in. Just like I said, for orbiting around or scrubbing through the viewport, the timeline, it can get a little slow because it's reading the cache 3 times now, which that's the only kind of gripe I have with what we're doing. But I mean, it's part of the process. So that is all looking good. So we got this guy breaking apart into different groups and doing everything we need. So I just want to clarify a lot of different things here, but I know that these are things that will come up later on that you'll probably want to know. So anyway, now we're going to move into, now we have this set up, I'm probably going to hide it in the viewport, but I want to start setting up Phoenix and doing a fluid sim. Okay. Now, if you don't have Phoenix, if you have Fume Effects, it's the exact same process. If you wanted to use a different program for the fluids, whatever you wanted to do, it's all good. Okay. So I just wanted to show this again, like what we have. So the character's blowing away, doing its thing, the whole thing breaking apart. And the big challenge now is that this is all geometry caching, which is cool for rendering. So like I said, this is where we would hand it to the lighting department. They can go and light the whole thing, do all that. In fact, we're going to be the lighting department. Later on, we're going to light and shade this and render it, all that stuff. But for now, we want to go and create like a smoke simulation around all of this. So we need to go back into TyFlow and now create a cache specifically for that. But basically, this is like the general feel for what we have. And so jumping back to the camera view, I'm going to turn these guys off. And if we wanted to just turn them off in here, I hit F11, that's the hotkey to bring this up, F11. At least, you know, the current version that I have, it is. My hotkeys are kind of old. So I hit TFC display off, and that means that it has disabled them, so it should be faster loading, okay? Anyway, so let's get rid of that junk for now, and let's go back into TyFlow. So here's the general idea. Here's what I want to do. This is a particle system, but we want to then have it generate particles exclusively for creating all of our smoke. So the way that I want to do this, we go our export, I'm just going to put it up there. The way I'm going to do this is I want to have an additional emitter. So that way, as these pieces float around, I'm going to have them generate more particles. So let's start with the head, just because I know that the head is going to be something that moves pretty quickly. So I'm just going to turn all of these guys off. The other thing I just want to quickly mention is that, as you saw, like we've got a lot of geometry. I don't want you to freak out thinking that in general this is you know, how heavy scenes need to be. This is, by the end of this will be an exceptionally heavy scene, but most of what we do in effects doesn't need to be this heavy. Okay, so for instance, in the Effects TD mentorship, we do a lot of effects. There's 16 modules. We cover, I think, 700 hours of training over a year. And the thing is that, like, we might do an explosion, we'll have the ground ripping apart. You know, we might do something like this shot. We might do a building being destroyed, but typically it's pretty interactive. It's just in this instance, we're having it really disintegrate down to such a macro level that it does get heavy. So I just don't want you to be discouraged by how heavy this particular shot could be. Okay, so now that we have the head, I'm just going to scrub through here. Oh yeah, so we need to go TyFlow, enable. So just so that way we've enabled the particle system, and now we can see we have the head blowing away, doing its thing. So this probably is already enough particle information to work with, but what I might do, sorry, let me just get a bit of room here. So what I might do in addition is we can create a spawn. So I'm just going to say spawn. I'm doing this out of the viewport here, but I'll drag this now in here, because these are the active particles. This is where it begins to float away. So really important, make sure to link this to another system, because otherwise it's going to spawn inside of the same event and it'll cause a loop, which will build up a lot of particles really quickly. So make sure that this is connected to a new group. We'll go to the first frame as well. We can see new particles are being generated. So what I want to do, I want to use this spawn, and I'm going to get it based on its distance to create new ones. So that way, whenever the particles move, they're going to create new particles. And we don't need to do it for all of them. If we did, it would get really slow really quick, because it's generating new particles as this moves around. So what I want to do instead is I want to give it like a percentage. Let's say like 5% of the particles are spawning new particles. So if I change that spawn, it's only 5%, or whatever feels right for you. I want you to use your brain here and decide on, you know, what feels right for you, rather than just following, you know, my steps. So in other words, do you want more? Do you want less? The whole idea is that these are going to emit smoke. So I set a percentage to 5% are going to emit particles based on that distance of 1. 1, I believe, is 1 centimeter. Because we are using centimeters. And so from here we have, you know, if we scrub through, we're generating more and more particles as these fly away. And they're going to this event, which currently doesn't have any behaviors set up, but it's doing its thing. So what we can do on top of that, I can go inherit, and right now the particles are set to 100% inheritance. That means that if you had, let's say a tennis ball, maybe this is a terrible analogy, but if you had a tennis ball and that was a particle and you threw that tennis ball and then you told it to emit particles, those particles are going to fly the same speed 100% of that tennis ball. But what if you wanted them to just trail behind? Like, let's say that it was smoke coming off of it rather than water, or I don't know, something like that. We might want to slow the inheritance down a little bit. So I can set this to 75%, and then on top of that, I could vary it a little bit, and that way it's more random. It's around 75%, but it's 50% variation of that. And that way we're now getting kind of random results. You can see some up here are trailing, and others are flying around, more standalone. Now, on top of that, we could give it divergence, which means that as it flies through the air, it's going to spread out, opposed to giving like a really fine thing. So now we're getting more kind of crazy particles from doing that. Okay, so this looks a bit crazy, but let's add a slow operator, and that will allow us to kind of keep it more contained. And I'm just going to scrub through this for a second, but now we can see we have particles and they're emitting everywhere. Now, on top of that, I'm going to add a delete operator, and this delete operator kills the particles when they come into the event. I don't want to do that. I want to tell these particles to live for 10 frames. So when we click on the delete operator, these new particles, we can say on entry, it activates. I want to click here, and in the drop down, I want to say, I think, particle age. And then we can say it's active between 10 to 1000. Like, this doesn't matter. It's just basically saying after 10 frames, delete those particles. And you can randomize that too if you wanted to. But the whole point is that now each of these new particles being generated is going to live for 10 frames and then die. And that should be enough that we're just constantly emitting new particles that live for a little bit, they're kind of contained, and then they die out. Okay? And that's going to continue to happen for all of these the entire time. So, hopefully I haven't lost you, but all we're doing is we're having them have a bit of drag, 75% inheritance on the speed, with a bit of divergence to spread, and we're telling them to die after 10 frames. That's all we're currently doing. Now, one thing is that it's a little bit slow too, because it's generating particles based on this shape or the fragments, whatever's coming in. So it's inheriting the shapes from in here, which means that it's creating more and more and more geometry. We can't see it, but if I were to change the display to geometry, come on, you'll see it's creating more of this. It's duplicating, it's creating more and more of these frags, which obviously kind of, bogs things down a little bit. So what I want to do, there's actually a shape remove. This is cool. I wish more systems had this, because we're basically saying kill the shape when it comes in here. So that way these new guys, they're coming up as crosses. And the reason for that, if you go to display, it says display geometry. And then it says mark particles with no geo. So in other words, it's saying like it's representing these X's as a mark because there's no geometry assigned to them, which is exactly what we want, because we want to use this with Phoenix, right? We don't need this to be geometry or anything like that at all. So again, I'm going to change this back to like pixels or something small. I just want to draw these blue particles which represent our Phoenix emitter. So finally, I want to get our force. I'm going to right click, copy, paste it in here just as a regular paste. And this way we can give it a little bit of turbulence too. We can just kind of make it a bit more of an interesting motion. So with this, I can probably keep it relatively the same as what we had. I don't think we need to mimic it. And it just means it's going to follow the same kind of behavior. I'll do this from the camera view. Just to make it a bit more interesting. So as it flows around, it's still following the same rules that the rest of the particles have, but we're just generating more of this. And this is what I talked about with filling in the negative space. Because if I were to turn off display, you could see all the geometry, but then this is kind of filling all of that out. And this is what we're going to use for all the smoke as that gets generated. So currently, we've just done this for the head. So as the head breaks apart, we can see it's going to generate smoke. What about the rest of the body? Well, now that we've got this here, we could right-click, rename it to spawn, let's say smoke. And we've got all of these other guys. We've got the right arm. Let's go to his left arm. So the left arm comes into the subfrag, so it's not active here, but then when it comes in here, it's active, but it instantly sends out. Okay, so at that point, what we could do is we could actually have it generate like some more trails, right? So in other words, as they come into the air bits, this is where we could have it also generate smoke. So I'm going to right click, copy, paste. Let's do an instance for now. Now, really careful, really important, because I shouldn't have done that. Be careful. I really urge you to be careful pasting spawn by distance into other events if the particle system's turned on. Because think about it. If you have 10 particles in this node and they're not going anywhere, then you sample again. Let's say it's emitting one particle. Okay, just one single particle per one. The next time around, that's going to be 20 particles. And then that's going to be 40 particles. And it's going to exponentially, or it's going to compound basically over time. These need to always spit out to a new event. So be careful, because luckily I'm on the first frame, so no particles being generated, but otherwise you can end up with millions of particles in a split second because they're just compounding in the same event. So just be aware of that like you want to make sure that they're going out. So usually I'll turn my system off and paste something like that in, or however I want to do it. Just be careful, because otherwise your machine might freeze or whatever. I think the hotkey is Shift Escape, and Typhlo is good at that, to quit out of something. You can hit Shift Escape and it should do it. But just be careful in general. Like this is with any system whatsoever, because it's user error. It's not the software. Okay, so I've got the particles now spawning, going into this event as well. So in other words, we're keeping the same behavior. We're just now telling it to use it for the arm as well. So now we have that left arm, and as that left arm begins to move, it's generating particles into this smoke event. So we're spawning smoke again. So you can see that part of the arm is now doing it as well. Now, the cool thing is that we set up this behavior for this. And as we can see, we have all of these guys feeding into the same events. So at this point, if I wanted to, I could just turn them all on. Again, probably want to go to the first frame, so that way you're able to do this quicker. But I'm just turning all of these events on. And now the beauty of that is that the entire body is generating particles as they begin to break apart. And if we wanted, like, let's say that we start doing this, we're like, man, it's too dense, there's too much going on. The cool thing is that this spawn is a separate thing. So I could right click and just break the instance. So make unique, and that's going to break that instance between the two. And it means for this, I could actually say to emit less, because we're emitting a lot in the head, but there's not too much to emit. But with the body, maybe we want to use less particles. And that way you can inherit it more, you can do whatever you want, but they are all going to end up going to the same event here as they break apart. So now that we've done that, the last thing that I'm kind of deciding whether to do, but we could have it when they initially break, they could create like a puff of dust. I think we'll skip out on that, but I'll explain how to do it at least. Okay, so while we're playing through here and we're looking at the pretty particles, back here when it goes to subfrag, so when it's still a big piece, we could do a spawn there, And we can actually say to use the voxel shape, and that way it'll respect the big chunk piece before it breaks. And then we could just have it spawn to a new event, and we put like a speed operator on there, so it just kind of explodes a big puff. And that way, whenever anything fractures, before it begins trailing or anything, it can create like a puff of smoke that then we feed into this event as well. Okay, so it'll just be a spawn on the big shape before it fractures and does all that, and then have that respect the actual shape, use a speed to explode it, and then feed it back into here. And that way, every single time something fractures and activates, we'll get like a quick kind of crack and puff of smoke, and then the whole thing will trail and blow away. So, again, we can start to really kind of choreograph the whole behavior. But again, I want to keep this straightforward, like little things like that will take time to do and won't significantly change the shot. I figure we don't need to really go down that path this time because we got a lot to do over these 10 lessons. So right now, that's our setup. And as you can see, as it begins to break apart, we're getting more and more stuff happening, and they all end up here. So finally, how the hell do we get this into Phoenix? The way that I want to do this, again, because it's heavy anyway, I want to create another export node. So let's say export, and let's name these. I'm just going to call this PFD, so Phoenix FD, let's say smoke, and then here I'm going to say export PRT. Okay, so this guy I'm going to say export geocache, just so we're naming these, they make sense. And if we get hit by a bus, someone else can take over our shot. So with the export here, we've got these different export types: object, PRT, typhoid cache, Alembic, point cloud. I'm going to export a PRT. We could say age. We don't really need to worry about this. Velocity, position, ID. Those are the important ones. Now, we've got a few different options for this. We could export the entire thing, but then it's going to emit particles right away. So I want to do this when they get activated. So these are the only two active groups. With all of these other ones, they're initially static, they're not moving, and then they become active. So what we can do, we can set up a particle group. And we could call this PRT group, and then just say smoke B. Or, sorry, what am I saying? Smoke. Let's call it smoke. Okay, so we've got this event, and I'm going to put this here. And again, unfortunately, I've got my system on, so it's responding a little bit slow. So to fix that, I'm just going to disable flow. You can see it's red. Okay, so let me just delete that. So now that we have this here, we can say export, and we can say D. So we had A, B, C, D, and this will allow us to export specifically just this group and none of the other ones. Okay, so before we're exporting everything, but it tagged it all with a group. This time around, we exclusively just want to export one group. So what we can do, we go to General, and we can choose what group we want to export. Now, for whatever reason, D is actually here. Again, this is in beta, so there's a little tiny things like this which is so low priority that, you know, I'm sure it's on the list. But anyway, so D is located here, so A, B, C, D, and we just want to export that one group. Now, as I mentioned before, these are tagging everything, so that way it exports, it continues to keep that relationship, and then it comes into here. So this is the important thing I just want to mention. Right now we say change set to D. So this would actively change the particles to this group. And we don't want to do that. We actually want to add it to this group instead. So this is important because that way it's still going to respect that it's skin, shirt, lower body, but then D, we're just adding them to this group as well. So now all of these will also respond in D. So hopefully that makes sense. It can be a bit confusing, but all we're doing is we're basically tagging it so that way it'll respect everything that comes into this event as being the D group. And that way when we export it, it'll go into D. I'm also going to, and so we're adding, not setting or removing or anything. So I'm going to copy, and I'm also going to paste instanced. Does that work? Copy, paste instance in there. So now these two groups. So we have the one emitting particles, but then we also have the ones flying around. Like maybe we don't need to worry about this guy at all and just exclusively do this one, but I figure what the hey. So anyway, right now we're just going to export the D group and that's it. All right, and it's adding, not setting. So now when we go back to our PRT, we can go to general settings and we can say, I only want to export D. So I think when I was talking, so bear with me, I'm just going to turn that off for the geocache because I was just explaining it. But with this one, we genuinely want to export just the D group. And this means that when we export the PRTs, it's only going to, it'll calculate all this, but it's only going to write out caches for these two groups. So the particles being static and everything, that won't show up. And the reason for that is it just means that we just have this to work with. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, but it means that now we can go in here, we can enable our flow. Let's wait for this to turn on. And we just need to set a path for this as well. It's going to make a new directory. I'll call this PRT. And we can call it whatever. I'm just going to call it particles. And so timeline, we want all the entire sequence done because obviously we want to pre-roll this as well. So let's just hit generate. Now another interesting thing, let's do this. Let's set this to 2. So what's going to happen is it's going to calculate all the way through one time, and then it's going to reseed it. In other words, it's going to regenerate the positions randomly and then generate another cache. So this way, like let's say that we didn't have enough particles being spawned, this will generate twice as many, but it'll only do it on export. So when we hit export now, I might just save my scene. I'm just doing a hold. But when I generate this now, what's going to happen is it's going to write out the cache twice with different positions. We'll have twice as much information to work with. And from there, it'll just be that D particle group. We'll be able to bring this in and work with Phoenix. Okay, so that's complete. I can right click and disable this. Oops. Disable flow, enable caching. Okay, so that's turned off. Now, what we want to do is we want to bring this back in. So the way that we read PRTs, I could be wrong about this. I just assume that Frantic Films developed the PRT format because with Krakatoa, and it became more universal. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they adopted it from someone else. Like Chris Batty and Mark Weeb were the guys who wrote a majority of that. But either way, V-Ray now supports it. So if we go to helpers V-Ray, or sorry, Phoenix, we can see PRT reader. I'm going to pull this into the viewport and modify panel, select our sequence, and we have our caches. Now, before, okay, so one thing is this didn't export. Dope. I gotta look into what's going on with that. But before I mentioned that Tyflow may or may not support negative frames, it might have actually been the PRT loader that doesn't. So I think that actually was what it was. But we can see here that we have 1 of 100, blah, blah, blah. And then we have 2 of 100. So this was the 2 groups. So we've got 2 sets of caches we can bring in. But I'm looking at the file sizes, they're 1 kilobyte. So I feel like that didn't work. I was going to go and take a quick look at this. So we have the export PRT, we're exporting D. So I'm thinking I might have discovered a bug, because remember we have A, B, C, E, F, D, G, H. So I'm thinking that this says D, but it's actually E, F. Yeah, it's something else. So I think I'm maybe chose just like one of the, rather than wasting time kind of guessing whether that actually is D, even though it says E, I'm just going to play it safe and say, oh, let's export O group instead. I'm guessing that that's what the issue is. So I'm going to go back to my PRTs. I'm going to say O. All right, and this is instant, so it updates both of them. Okay, so that's the me playing it safe, because what we've done is correct. Just for whatever reason, I think it's just, like I said, A, B, C, D, E, F, G is all good. With the export, it's, because it's in beta, A, B, C, E, F, D, G, H. So there's just that one discrepancy, but I just don't want to guess it. I'm assuming O is safe. So let's just roll with that. I'm going to do this again, but it should be correct this time. And one last thing, just make sure we enable our TypeFlow, because I disabled it. Okay, so now that I've re-exported that, we can see that all of these are a byte size, so they're all working. Now, as I mentioned, I have a feeling it wasn't TypeFlow, it was actually the PRT reader that doesn't work in negative frames. So let's test that out. Particle 1 of 100, we'll click, double click on that, that'll load that in. We can only load one at a time. So now I've loaded that in, let's right click on the move button and make sure we zero these out. So in other words, we're at origin. Just so, excuse me, so that way it's pointed in the right direction. Now if we were to scrub through this, I'm just going to turn TypeFlow off now that we're not using it. And there we go, we can see our particles are working. This is one group, so I'm going to right click again. I'm not going to worry about labeling these, but I'm going to copy that and click and load the second group, which is 2 of 100. And that way it's loaded that in. And let's go negative. Yep, so it doesn't work. So that's fine. I'm going to go back, right click, clone. And now we're going to do the negative one. So this is not so fun. But all we're doing is we see that we have the negative 01, negative 02, negative 03. So this is going backwards from 0 to negative 50. So I'm going to bring that guy in. I'm going to do it again one last time. So we got to have 4, because we got to have negative 50 to 0, and then 0 to 153, or whatever it is. And then there's 2 partitions, so we're going to do it twice. So hopefully this makes sense. We're just going to bring in the negative frame of the part 1 and part 2. Okay? So we got 4 of these loaders brought in that cover all of that. Now, as this breaks apart, we're seeing all of these particles being generated, and they'll continue to generate. And then, yeah, the lower body begins to activate around frame 40, so that's where we get that. Okay, so now we've got this, we can actually use this to plug into Phoenix and continue to get all of that working. So for that, let's save our work. And I'm going to go and make a Phoenix FD. So create primitives, or geometry, sorry, and then Phoenix FD, and then we'll do a fire smoke sim. And I just want to drag out roughly the dimensions I think that this will be, and then give it some height. Okay, now let's just loosely position this to cover a lot of it. We can tweak this later on. I just want to make sure I get most of it. And then in this viewport, so the front viewport, or the right, whatever, I'm just going to move this down a little bit so that way it covers the majority of the ground as well. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. We're just getting it encapsulated inside of this box. Change this to local and shift it a little bit. Okay, now that is our Phoenix grid. And we've got all these controls up here for Phoenix. To be honest, I don't really use these as much as I probably should. Maybe just the sim and pause, but they're there. I'm still going, I don't know why I just always do it this way, but you've got your emitters in here, but I'm just going to do a PHFX source. So helpers, Phoenix, because we're already in here for the PRT reader. Let's do a source, drop this in the viewport, and this will allow us to choose our emitters. So in other words, this is our grid that we're going to simulate our smoke with. This is the emitter that we're going to choose what we actually emit from. So going to the modify panel, I'm going to click add, and let's select all the PRTs. So PRT1, hopefully I can just do multiple. So I'm hitting select by name and doing, all of these. So to do that, I just hit add. I think this works. Select by name. And I'm trying to add them. Cool. So either way, we just want to add those 4 PRTs. Now it's going to emit from these 4 particle systems, or caches. Okay? And now what we want to do is we want to just set this up to control what we're emitting. By default, Phoenix will automatically add everything into a scene. So let's say in Fume Effects or a lot of other systems, you would typically choose your collision objects, choose your emitter objects, do all that. When Phoenix first came out as 1.0, it was kind of a new concept where automatically everything is just added in, which is kind of cool. But at the same time, like when I'm working on a shot, I want things to work very quickly and I want to have control over what is being considered. And I like that it does let you know about forces and stuff like that. But I kind of would prefer just to manually add things myself rather than the other way around. So it's just good to be careful about this stuff. The other thing I want to do is I'm going to get my Phoenix and this. I'm going to hit new group. And let's just call this Phoenix FD. So that way everything is going in here. It just makes it a bit easier to be able to turn it on and off when we need to. Okay, so let's just set up our emitter first of all. So I'm going to get my command panel here. I'm going to move my mouse over the side. I'm just going to pull this out a little bit. So that way I've got a little bit more room to work with. At least for Phoenix, it's going to expand over all of these tabs. So it just kind of gives me a little bit more room to work with if I want to go crazy with that stuff. Okay, so that's the general idea. Just giving me a little bit more room. So with the emitter, we've added in our particle systems. I want to do a few things. Outgoing velocity is just where we can kind of cap the amount of velocity. I just want you to be aware that it's there. The main thing is I don't want to export any temperature. I don't really care right now about that. I do want to export smoke, and we'll up the amount to about like 1.5. So we're just creating physically a lot of smoke being emitted out. Like density and opacity, like that's more shader related, but having more physical smoke will push it out and around. So I think that's important to have. But in general, we don't need to worry about this stuff too much. The main thing I would say that we do want to care about is the motion velocity. So this is like before we had that spawn operator and it allowed us to inherit the velocity. So that was, I think, 100%. No, yeah, it was 100%. Whereas with this, it's 1.0, which we'd consider, just treat it as a different increment. So 1.0, so in other words, 70% is 0.7, stuff like that. So with this, we can inherit whether the smoke trails behind or follows along with it. I actually want to kick it ahead of it a little bit. I want the particles, when they emit, it's going to get thrown forward a little bit. Typically you want to kind of go crazy with this, but I'm going to keep it around like 1.25, something like that. And all that's going to do is it's going to allow me to have the particles kind of projecting ahead of or the fluid's ahead of the particles a little bit. Other than that, I mainly just want to change the size to custom size. And we can set this to like 0.1. So I'm not doing anything too revolutionary here. All we did is we've mainly just set this to emit some smoke, turn off the temperature, and I'm giving it a little bit of inheritance on the velocity, and I'm setting the size, because when the particles get created, they can either be really big or really small. The fortunate thing is that we've got lots of particles. So I want to keep these relatively small because they're going to cluster together to make a bigger volume. Opposed to less particles, bigger volume, I want to get like lots of detail. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. We can always tweak this stuff later, but that's where you would inherit it. So trail behind or shoot forward. Size is how big the radius is going to be. And then, your temperature and smoke, stuff like that. So pretty straightforward. Now, going back into my container, like I said before, with the scene interaction, by default, we have a list of things we can exclude. For now, I'm happy to keep it as it currently is, where we're not excluding anything, but I want you to be aware that it's going to consider everything that's visible as being in the scene. So if we had Thanos unhidden, then it's going to use that as a collision object. So I want you to be really smart about this, because it's very easy to get really heavy objects in the scene that could cause problems. So the other thing I wouldn't mind thinking about is, if we wanted to, we could set up the geometry here. We could add like a shell modifier. Again, if things are closed, they work better. So I could set this to just the inner amount, so like 0.1. And that way it would consider all of this to be a collision object. It's something to think about. It will slow things down. The more it's going to collide with geometry, stuff like that. But in general, that would be how we could have it brushing along the ground. Obviously, I've got that little hole there, so we could fill that out. This was a LiDAR scan, which is like a laser scan. I'm going to be supplying some higher resolution ones later. But this was of the environment. I had it's like a $20,000 industrial LiDAR scan that scans the entire environment, creates a model from it. And these are used for construction. And we also use them in feature film, which they're very expensive. Usually you hire a company to do it. And what will happen is you'll get back a completely accurate within 8 millimeters of the actual environment. And I'm able to use that to use as a collision object for camera tracking, for a lot of stuff. But I optimized this down because we don't want to have the original geometry is so dense, it's crazy. Actually, just for a second, this is my Instagram, Alan McKay Official, if you want to follow her there. But this is a LiDAR scan of the Santa Monica Pier, which is for another course of mine where, we went and scanned the entire Santa Monica Pier. So I figured I'd just mention this for a second, just because, again, like this is kind of the level of detail that you can get from it. Like I've physically captured the entire thing, and it's kind of cool that then once you have that, you can then turn that into a model, destroy it, do whatever you want. So that's what we're doing. We're gonna have like a big ship crashing into the Santa Monica Pier, destroying the entire thing, which is really cool. And it's going to be entirely live action. It's going to be a lot of fun. But I just wanted to mention that really quick, as that's where we get this geometry. But then obviously for this, I've dumbed it down because it's more for collisions, catching shadows, stuff like that. Okay, so having that on there, keep in mind it's visible, so it's going to be considered in the simulation. We don't have really too much more to do. I want to run a sim so we can see what we're working with. Couple things to keep in mind. Output, I'm going to choose where we're going to save this to. So browse. I'm just going to save that. Okay, and so let's just look through our grid. Start is going to run the simulation. Resimulation, we don't really need to worry about any of that right now. The grid is important, and that's going to be more to decide the resolution. So right now we can see the total cells being done. I think for temporarily we could change this a little bit just to, let's say with the cell size, we can set that to like 1.2, something like that. So in a moment we'll play with the resolution, we'll get it higher, but for now, this is where we can increase the resolution. We can see the total cells. So I'm just going to do initially a quick sim so we can see what it looks like, and then we can tweak it from there. The other thing is we've got this as open. This means whenever the fluids hit the wall of the grid, whether the grid grows or stays the same size. For now, I'm just going to say jammed both. And once we get an idea of how it looks, then we can make decisions and all of that. Same thing with whether it's an adaptive grid and choosing the channel that it samples based on. Dynamics. I'd say if anything, I know I want this to react kind of quick. So I'm going to up the time scale just a tiny little bit. I think that will help overall. And we could give this a little bit of gravity, and that way it's going to tend to fall down a little bit more. And I don't mind, because I want this to feel like it's got mass rather than being, let's say, fire generating smoke. I want this to feel like it's more just smaller particles, so there's still some mass to it. Okay, that's pretty much it. We could also do a bit of the buoyancy the same way, so negative 0.05. But I think in general, let's just leave it as is for now. And that's just going to give us just particles that are falling down a little bit. I do think that we'll probably need to sample this like twice per frame, something like that, steps per frame. But we'll keep it on 1 for now. So fuel, we don't need to worry about. Input, just standard stuff. Actually, this is a good point. We've got ways that we can read and offset the caches, things like that. So it's good to know that that's there. Preview, this is the one thing I will change. I'm going to set up the GPU, and that way we can actually see it in the viewport. It's just nice to look at. That's pretty much it. Like I haven't really changed much here. I turned on the GPU, and I just messed around a little bit with just the gravity and timescale, just a little bit. Okay, so let's run our initial sim, take a look, get a feel for it, and then we can make adjustments from there. Now, again, I just want to look through what's visible in the scene. I might, just that way we're aware, but I'm going to save our work really quick, hit sim, and it's kind of low res, so what we get back is going to look a little bit ugly, but like I said earlier, that we want to see like a version 1 of everything, because as technical directors, once we see something, we get an idea of what we need to change for the next time. So looking at this the first time, we can get an idea of how it's going to turn out, and then from there we can make our tweaks, come back in, and we're good to go. Now, to be honest, they're hidden anyway, but I've not tested out whether or not, like when you have the display and viewport off, in fact, it wouldn't cache it. So if you ever wanted the caches to collide with it, which I don't want to here, I don't really think is necessary, but in other sims we might. Obviously we need to have that enabled in the viewport. Okay, so this has been simulating for about 12 minutes, or 11 minutes. And hit stop. Now, a couple of things. I ran the sim, and it initially was taking a little bit of a long time. So just to be safe, I only have visible my Phoenix source, Phoenix FD, PRT readers, and the mesh. That's it. Everything else is hidden, just to play it safe. I prefer to use the exclusion opposed to just automatically including everything. But that took 11 minutes to get this far, which 17 frames plus the 50, so obviously 67 frames. And it's a good starting point just to kind of see what it's going to look like. Obviously, we got to now go make it look interesting, but it's just initially we want to see this and then decide what to tweak. Now, one other thing that I did tweak was I ran it and it looked a little bit too fine. So I just went into my Phoenix source here, the emitter, and I just adjusted the custom size from 0.1 to 0.15. Okay, so that's the only other thing I did, is I increased the size just slightly, just because it felt a little bit too small, too fine. But I think this is good as a good starting point. What I want to do now, though, is I want to start looking at giving it some turbulence, making it a bit more interesting. So let's make sure this is active, and we'll go into create helpers, and there's the Phoenix turbulence. So I'm going to drop this in the viewport, and in the modify panel, we can start to play around with this. Now, there is like this pattern which kind of represents what the turbulence is. It's the same way noise, like it's all kind of based on the same stuff, like the same algorithm. So showing streamlines kind of helps a little bit. The main thing is, we'll make this a little bit bigger just to start with. Doesn't really help. So we'll play around with this in a moment. Sorry, size is what I was trying to do, just to see it a little bit better. We're going to make this ultra small in a second, but the fractal depth is 3. These were all pretty much exactly what we want. So strength, I'm going to set to 15, the size to about 7. So I have in the past played around. I know that at that scale that works pretty well. But I mean, in general, that pattern is just something that's going to be more high frequency. It's going to break it up a lot more. So I think that's just a good, safe placeholder. Okay. That would be the main thing. But then, of course, in our Phoenix grid, let's start to play with the settings a little bit more. Like I said, having that turbulence in there, it's automatically going to be added to our grid, so we don't need to apply it or anything. But I think, mainly I just want to get some turbulence from this. I wouldn't mind getting a little bit more inheritance. Sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit with the emitter. I might just make this like 3 or something, so just throws forward a tiny bit. And we can increase the resolution a little bit now because I'd rather look at something that's a bit close to the final. So we'll do a cell size of 1. And I'm just thinking I might increase the resolution more. Let's try 0.8. I'll do like 0.7. So again, don't worry about the cell size. More look at the total cells. But I think that that's a good starting point. And I think, like, for the most part, we've got something that works. We're just going to run the simulation now, but adding turbulence was one thing that I definitely think that we need to have. And I wouldn't mind adding in some wind. Okay, so I'm going to go into create, and then to space warps, and then we have these forces. Okay, so I'm going to get wind, and I'm going to drag this wind into the viewport. Let's rotate it to point in the direction that everything else is going. So all the particles are flowing this way. And let's just move this behind the fluid. And with strength, it's pretty sensitive. And I just want to add this on top. There's just a slight bit of drift. We'll put that at 0.08. Again, like, I know roughly the settings. That's why I'm just throwing them in. But I know how sensitive this can be. So we don't want it to feel like it's, I'm trying to think of the right term for it. Like, yeah, something that's just like blasting out a lot of wind through here, like an air tunnel, I guess, or whatever it is. But I just want to have a slight drift to it, so adding that in there really helps. We can also add some extra turbulence. I'm just going to throw in, these are random settings, just like 0.025, 0.5 turbulence. Is something to help kind of pull it apart a little bit. So that'd be the main thing, is just adding the extra bit of turbulence. I feel like overall, like, that's pretty much as far as we need to go. Like, out of the box, Phoenix gives some really good results. There's a lot of subtleties that work really well. I don't think there's anything else that we would need to change here. I'm going to run the sim. From there, we can tweak the shader if we need to. But, I think overall, this should work out really well for our needs. Okay? So I'll run the sim, and you can check it out. If it is slow for you, then under grid, just increase the cell size to make it bigger, which means if you're picturing like image resolution, you're downsizing the resolution. The pixels will be bigger by increasing the size. So I'm going to run the sim, and we'll just see how this turns out. Again, always good to save, so that way you've got something to revert back to if for whatever reason you ran into any issues. Okay, so this is still simming, but I'm going to jump back in. So it's been simming for 1 hour and 16 minutes. It's still got an hour to go. So I mean, it's fairly high resolution, so that's why. But yeah, it's looking pretty cool. So first of all, I'd probably assume that it's a little dense, right? The smoke. So what we can do now is just tweak the shader a little bit to make it match that. Man, okay, so simming, it is a little bit slow to write this out. So responding is dog slow. What I want to do, I'm just going to go down to the rendering, and under volumetric, click volumetric options, or under rendering, volumetric options, and we got this window. Now, I'm not going to do much. I'm literally just going to drop the smoke opacity down. I don't want to really mess around with this too much. You know, we can make complicated shaders, we can do a lot with it, but I mainly just want to drop the density, so that way I can take a look at this, and I think that that looks pretty good overall. There's not too much more I want to do here. I think that, you know, we've got a system that's set up, it's all being driven by our TypeFlow cache, so this will all match the motion and everything that we're going for. I will, let's just view the, I guess the particles are viewed. This is like a redraw thing, so it's prioritizing the volumetrics above everything else. So what I might do is get the skin layer, unhide it, let's display it in the viewport, because I'm sure geometry will show up. So this might take a second to turn on, but it should be matching that pretty accurately. And from here, like the only things I would change, because again, like I keep saying this, but you need to see something to see the next result. But usually the more familiar you get with the behavior, and this happens by exploring, like if you just follow my settings and you don't think at all, great, you'll be able to replicate what I'm doing, but that's not the point. What I want you to do is fully understand why we're doing it and what everything does, and that's why I don't just give you, click this button, I'm actually trying to explain to you everything, because this way you can think and you can make adjustments. You can look at this and see, what do I need to do to get this to final? And what are the steps I need to take to do that? So, for instance, me personally, I feel like some of the curls could be a little bit smaller, a little bit tighter. That'd be the only thing I would change. Like we can see this is all matching 100% with what's going on. I think this is looking really cool. And keep in mind, this is only showing the skin cache, so we've got some fluids here. That's obviously coming from the lower body, from the boots. So overall, this is cool. The only thing I would change, I would get the turbulence, and I would just change the scale of that to be a little bit smaller, like the size. And in addition to that, so where are we? So fractal depth, yeah, we keep it the same, but size, I would probably drop it to 2 or 3. And then inside of the Phoenix container, you could change a few of the internal settings about how it handles a large size turbulence and stuff like that. I think that you wouldn't need to, though. It's primarily just the turbulence here, and perhaps the turbulence on the wind spacewalk. Because yeah, there are controls in here for vorticity and things like that. I don't think we need to worry about that so much, because the scale and everything is good. I think it's more with this, I would probably put this like 0.06 or 07, because the higher the value, the smaller the scale with this sort of stuff. It makes sense when you start to think technically about it, but it doesn't make sense to explain it. But the higher the value, the smaller the scale on the wind spacewalk. So those are the two things I would change, is the turbulence here to a higher scale, making it smaller, and then on the actual Phoenix turbulence node here, I would just change the size to be smaller. And then I would just get more crunchy kind of curls and stuff like that. That'd be the only thing I would really change. Overall, I think this is looking really cool. Like I said, we're going to get into rendering, lighting, and compositing in a later lesson, but I wanted to go through how to break apart our cache, so that way we can work with it. I want to explain some of the under the hood stuff that will be really helpful for us. And I wanted us to set up a fluid simulation based on our TypeFlow setup. And again, you can apply this workflow to anything. So I think this is working out really well. And in the next lesson, we can check out the final result, as well as, not in the next lesson, sorry, I'll take that back in. what we're going to do in the next lesson, we're going to segue to another shot and we're going to work on that. And then we're going to start to bring this all together. We'll start to render everything, light everything, get photorealistic lighting and shaders, break out all our render elements, bring in the compositing, and we'll start to look at all of our shots coming together. So we're currently working on one shot, but I want to work on a few more. I want to have the close-up of Thanos' head ripping apart. I want to have a wider shot of the aftermath of all the ash. There's a lot of different things we're going to be doing. It's going to be really cool. For now, I'm going to let this sim, and then we can look at the final result. Okay, so we'll wait a little bit longer, and here is the final result. So this is looking really good. We can see it's all peeling away as the character breaks apart. We have all the smoke, and the wind is strong. It's looking really good. So I like this overall. I don't like that it hangs a little bit at the very end. There's that, you know, because I feel like with the wind, it shouldn't be doing that. But overall, I think this looks really good. So I'm quite happy with this and how it's turned out. However, this is a test render just so we can see kind of like what to expect. So, you know, similar to this, I think this is going to be high resolution. This is one that I've done previously, but I thought I would share it. This is with lighting and things though. So there's a lot of like vertical lines coming through, and that's actually shadows from leaves inside the environment. A lot of cool stuff like that. So we're going to get into some really cool lighting and shading and integration. It's going to be really cool. So you can see all the light kind of strobing through here. It's pretty cool. But yeah, I'm going to simulate this and render it higher resolution in one of the upcoming lessons. But so far, this is looking cool. It's definitely matching the look and feel that we're going for. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this training. I hope you got a lot from it. Like I said, this is the tip of the iceberg. We're going to be covering so much in the future lessons. Now, I remember so many times back in the day, I'd be working on a single computer and I'd be working my FX and I'd be doing the kind of low-res simulations over and over, but I couldn't wait to go to sleep at night because that's when I could dial up the settings and let it simulate overnight, wake up in the morning and see the final result. So this is a chance for you to have a simulation that might take a few hours to sim, but this is something that you can dial up overnight and check it out in the morning and be excited about what you've accomplished. So stick with it, and in the next lesson, in the next video, we're going to be switching gears and doing a lot more really exciting stuff. So I'm going to be doing a lot over the coming videos, and all of this is going to come together to create a whole sequence of effect shots. So I'm really excited for you to see what you can do with it, and I can't wait to see you in the next video. Before I forget, check your inbox. I'm going to be sending the next video pretty soon. I'm working hard at building these in real time, and like I said, I'm going to reply to as much email as I can. So enjoy, and I'll see you in video 3.